Hey everyone, Jeremy Gerard from Mythic Customs here with one of my short customizing tutorial videos. Today's topic is one that a lot of people probably don't want to think about, but it's really relevant to the conversation, and that's what you should do when you mess up a custom part. Now, if you look at a lot of Mythic Legions customizers, you look at their body of work, it's very easy to think that they don't make mistakes, but nothing could be further from the truth. If you look at my portfolio, I don't tend to post all the mistakes that I make, on my Instagram page and so forth, but that certainly does not mean that I don't have my share of missteps along the way. And the reality is everyone customizing these figures have those same challenges. So what I wanted to do today was just give a little bit of advice around some of the ways that I handle the situation when I make a mistake. And it really, of course, depends on what the mistake is, but the solution that you're going to follow is definitely going to be tied into the severity of the mistake. So here's some tips for you to consider. The first thing that I'll point out is, as you're painting these, and say you're painting a 3D part, okay? You've got a part from a 3D printer, you've hit it with a base coat, and you're starting to paint it, and something happens that you're not happy with. Maybe the paint itself was, too watery or whatever, and it ran into an area of the sculpture that you didn't want it to. This has happened to me more times than I can count. What I have done in many, many cases is very, very quickly go to a sink, take that 3D part and run it under some hot water to get that paint off. Now, obviously, if you've been working on that part and you've got layers of paint there, I've got a dwarf head here from Wolf King Customs that was sculpted by my friend Emil Wickman, and we're going to talk about him in a few minutes. But, this particular piece here, it's got the paint on the hair and the beard. It's got the paint on the flesh, on the teeth, on the eyes. If I've painted everything and the last part I'm doing is the eyes and I mess it up and I go and I run that under hot water, I'm very likely going to ruin some of the other parts as well. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But that is certainly one thing that I've done is try to get that paint off as quickly as possible. That's one of the things that you can certainly consider doing. There have even been times where if I don't have something where like the paint is really liquidy and it flows everywhere, that's a situation where I would definitely go try to rinse it off. But what if you're painting something really fine detail like an eye and you go a little bit too far and you get a tiny little bit of paint? There have been times that I've actually taken like an X-Acto blade or one of my little like sculpting tools, and I've just taken that very, very fine tip and tried to scrape off that little bit of excess paint. And that has worked for me at times as well. So that's another thing you can do is try to just get that little paint off. If you can't get the paint off, one of the things you can do is go back and paint over the mistake later. So that's another tip that I'll offer. And sometimes you kind of have to do that. So let's look at this figure here. This is one of my, I should say, Mythic Legions tributes to Boba Fett. This is one I did somewhat recently. The first version I did was the classic looking Boba Fett in the really beat up armor. This is, the newer, cleaner looking armor with a lot of black, the way that he appeared in the Mandalorian show on Disney Plus. When I was doing this, one of the things I want you to notice is the yellow that I have on his shoulder pauldrons. Now, that's a metallic yellow, and I was painting it on top of these glossy black pauldrons. These pauldrons came from a Black Knight Legion builder. What I found was trying to paint that metallic yellow on top of the black, it wasn't going on very effectively at all. So what I did, I didn't want to just glop it on there because I wanted to maintain all of those nice sculptural details in the armor. So what I did was, big surprise, I dry brushed it on. I love dry brushing. If you watch any of my videos or my Mythic Conversation show, you know how much I love dry brushing. So I dry brushed that metallic yellow on. And what it allowed me to do was build up layers of paint over time and eventually get kind of the density and the coverage that I wanted. Works really well. The problem with dry brushing is it's not a very precise approach. As I was dry brushing, I was coloring outside of the lines, if you want to put it that way. So what I did after the fact was I wanted this nice, clean, tight yellow line, but I had bled over on the edges, so I just took some glossy black paint after the fact with a nice fine brush, and I painted over the parts that had gone outside of the lines. So that's another tip that I would give you when you make mistakes. If you go outside of the area you want to paint, is there a way that you can paint the overage, paint the part that bled outside of the lines, the color that you want it to be in the first place? And this is obviously something like glossy black armor. That's very, very easy for me to do. If you're doing a head and you go a little bit over the eyes, maybe you can get a little bit of that flesh color and you can just paint around there to fix the problem. There have been times where I've gone over, I've done the eyes and a little bit has bled out, where I'll take a little bit of black after the fact and I'll very lightly put a black line underneath the eyes to get rid of that little bit of excess kind of eyeball color that bled out of the sculptural area. What it does is not only does it clean up the space, but it actually often gives a really cool kind of almost shadow look underneath the eye anyway. Again, those are some of the tips that I've used when I've gone outside of the lines. I mentioned before about going into the sink and rinsing stuff off. That's what I did here for this figure. So this is one of my male frost elves. This is like a male frost elf king that I put together, and the head that he uses is from a Lord Adon figure. I removed the normal crest on that head, and this is one that originally came on an Artemis silver cord. When I was painting this, I was trying to lighten the skin tone because the frost elf, there's one frost elf in Mythic Legions so far that's been released, Thalon Frostbow. Her skin color is a lot lighter than the skin color on Lord Adon, for instance. So I wanted to lighten the skin color on Lord Adon so it could kind of match the Thalon Frostbow. I had a really hard time doing that. As I was painting that, it just wasn't coming out. I ran it through the sink multiple times, and what ended up happening was some of the deep pockets of detail, like around the eyes and around the nose and stuff, I couldn't get the paint out. So as I started painting over that, I was getting this inconsistent color, but I just worked with it. And that's one of the tips that I would offer is sometimes when you make a mistake, instead of just tossing that out, try to rethink a little bit the way that you're actually working with this. Is there a way that you can salvage this, even if it is a little bit different than what you originally imagined? I got the skin tone I was going for, but instead of it being a flat, unified skin tone, there are little pockets that almost makes it look like his skin has a little bit of a condition. It's kind of cool. It's kind of different. It stands out with the collection, but not really in a bad way. So I went with it, and it ended up working. In other instances, you can rethink what you want to do in a totally different way. So here's an Iron Dwarf custom that I did using a wonderful head from my friend Anthony House-Seal at Toy Forge. This one was sculpted by Travis Canning. They have a whole group of dwarfs that they do. They call the Dwarves of Canning Valley. When I started painting this, I originally was going to go with a flesh type color. I started painting it. I didn't really like the way it was coming out. So the nice thing that you can do is you can always cover it with a darker paint. So I said to myself, you know what? I don't like this flesh color. I was originally trying to match it to, another flesh color. It wasn't coming out how I wanted. I really just did a 180 and thought about it differently. And I said, I'm going to make him an Ironborn dwarf. And I'm going to make it almost like his skin looks like it's iron. A lot easier because I was just going for a dark color here. I wasn't trying to match a certain kind of flesh tone. Matching flesh tone with any of these is very, very challenging. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. So that's another tip that I'll say here is sometimes, like I did with the elf, you can just try to salvage the project and it can be what you wanted it to be, just maybe a little bit different than your vision. Other times, you may just need to pivot and you may need to try to think about how can I use this in a different way that is going to cover up the mistake that I just made. I do that with eyes all the time. Sometimes if you're painting eyes and they're meant to be more realistic eyes, with pupil and iris and everything, and they don't look really, really good, well, maybe that character's possessed. Paint the eyes all black. Or start over. If it doesn't look good, just start over. Paint the eyes black, paint them white again, put in the the pupils and everything. Go through and recreate what you were looking to do. So those are two kind of suggestions there. One, rethink how you're doing it, cover it in a way that the coverage looks really good and that's what you actually want for that character now, or cover it and start over. Fortunately, that doesn't always work. Back to this guy's head here. This was a head that I had a really, really hard time with. It's actually no longer in my display because I was never satisfied with how it came out. I originally wanted to use this to make like a cool moonshiner type dwarf. So what I had done was I had gotten one of the kind of large bellied torso sculptures from Planetary Dog Toys, and I got a Torgon Redfin figure to have the bare arms, and I had this head. So I had already had a flesh tone from the bare arms of Torgon. Now I had to match the torso, which is a very large piece. Okay, there's a lot of coverage there, and I had to match all of the pieces in the face here. Now, I don't like painting parts like this. I don't like painting realistic faces. It's never been something that I'm super comfortable with. I've done it quite a bit. I've got a lot of pieces in my collection like that I've done that I like very, very much. But it's okay not to enjoy every kind of custom. It's okay to say that, hey, I enjoy, in my case, I enjoy painting parts that are grimy, that look worn and nasty, battled, scuffed up and everything. I love that style. I also love painting my critter, characters. All of the custom heads that I work on with Wolf King and with Walter DeMarco, all these critters like the Kitsune and the Badgers and so forth. I love painting those. It's really enjoyable. I love dwarves. I love barbarians. Just don't really like painting them as much. So this was an example that I struggled to get that paint match, was never happy with it, in part because I started over too many times. This was an example where nothing seemed to work for me. I ran it underwater to clear it. It got pockets in there. I tried putting more paint over it. Didn't look good. Put more paint over it. Tried to base it out in different colors. I based it out in black first. Then I based it out in light brown and I tried so much that it got to the point that there was too much paint on it. And I felt like some of the sculptural details were lost and it just looked like a thick paint job that didn't fit in, certainly with the Mythic Legions line or even with my other customs. And that's another lesson. Sometimes you are going to make a mistake and you're going to have to throw these out. You're going to have to say, you know what? I tried. It didn't work for me. Whether you get another copy of that head and try over, or whether you just, call it a day and move on to something else, that's okay. There are going to be times where you make a mistake that you can't recover from. Most of the time you can. That's the good news. Most of the time you can find a way to salvage it. Now I have had people ask me, whether you should strip the paint, because I just talked about running it under, water in the sink. I've had people say, oh, should I use paint thinner, paint remover? Should I use like nail polish with acetone? I would suggest don't do those things. I have used nail polish with acetone to remove paint before. I've done it both from custom painted parts that I messed up, and I've done it from actual factory parts that I messed up. The reality is there's a very, very small window of error that you have when you use those kinds of strippers. So when I've used like acetone, it's really hard to get all the paint. You got to get like a brush or something and try brushing it off. It's not one of those things where you just like dip it in and the paint just falls off. It is not a really clean process. It's really hard to get all of those little crevices. So a lot of the flat surfaces, the paint will come off with the acetone, but a lot of the crevices, it won't. And in my opinion, it makes the situation worse. If you leave the part in for too long, you're going to significantly damage the part. I remember years ago I put an actual scaphoid head, the green poison skeleton. I had an extra head. I put that in some nail polish with acetone to try to remove the green color because I wanted to see if I could make it a different color. And it was in there for so long that the green paint certainly came off, but the plastic started to actually deteriorate. I pulled it out, ran it under cold water, cleaned it up. In the spirit of, taking a mistake that you made, that was a mistake, right? I put it in there for too long. The plastic started to degrade, but I took that mistake and the skull was so deteriorated that it actually looked kind of cool. I ended up putting it on like a spare, and I put it on a character's back, like an executioner type character that had a couple spears, a couple skulls on spears on his back. And that really decayed skull actually looked really, really cool. So, I made lemonade out of lemons in that case. But you're not going to always want to do that. You're not going to always have that ability. Certainly in the fact that it was a kind of nasty skull, it worked for me. If it would have been a dwarf head, probably not so much. So personally, I would avoid using any of those type of strippers to try to get that paint off. Those are my suggestions. Those are the things that I would do when it comes to making mistakes and trying to recover from them. I'm certainly asking in the group if you have, a specific situation you don't know how to recover. There's a ton of great painters in the groups that you can certainly ask. Show a picture of of what you're working on and what your challenge is with. I know sometimes that may feel really intimidating because no one wants to put their mistakes out there. I mentioned at the top of this video that if you look at our portfolios, if you look at Customizer's portfolios, you don't see all the mistakes. And I mean, of course, that makes sense. It's a portfolio. It's like having an art gallery. You're not going to put up the paintings that you don't like. If you're a chef, you're not going to serve the recipes that didn't work out. You want to, serve the ones that went really, really well. It's the same thing here. Make no mistakes. That doesn't mean that we haven't stepped in it from time to time, and it certainly doesn't mean that we aren't willing to help you out. So if you have a mistake that you want some help with, consider posting in the Mythic Legions Cabal or whatever customizing group you're a part of and ask for some advice as well. Hopefully that, coupled with some of the tips that I've offered here, will help you out in terms of how you can recover if you do make a small mistake on your next custom project. If you enjoyed this video and videos like it, certainly give it a like. Let me know in the comments. If you haven't subscribed to the channel already, consider doing so you'll be notified when videos like this go live. And certainly if you use any of these tips and you find them helpful, consider tagging me in the post because like I always say, I can't wait to see what you make.